Everyone, I'm Tom Duggett, Senior Associate Professor in Literature here at XJTLU, Director of this series of Romantic Horizons seminars. So our format today, as always, is a 1-hour talk with 30 minutes for questions at the end. Actually, today, in a slight break from our normal routine, Greg's going to conclude his talk with a poetry reading to let us hear some of his own original poetry. And then after that, we'll have 30 minutes for questions. When we get to that point, please just use the raise hand or chat function and I'll come to you for your question. So I'm delighted to welcome to XJTLU today Professor Gregory Leadbetter of Birmingham City University. It's an honor and a pleasure to introduce Greg today, having known him and his work since back, I think, if memory serves, in 2012, when I first read his astonishing book on Coleridge and the Daemonic imagination and first attended the Coleridge Summer Conference run by the Friends of Coleridge, an organization of which he is now vice chair and director of its autumn Coleridge Quantic Weekend, this year celebrating Coleridge at 250. Greg's Coleridge book has been described by Seamus Perry as nothing less than a new way into Coleridge, a compelling and encompassing account of a powerfully heterodoxical mind. As a poet, a critic, and a spokesperson and defender of our discipline, Greg exemplifies what the Romantic poets Wordsworth and Coleridge called genial spirits, that undying hope in words from Coleridge's great Dejection Ode, still yet from outward forms to win the passion and the life whose fountains are within. Gregory Leadbetter is Professor of Poetry at Birmingham City University, where he is Director of the Institute of Creative and Critical Writing. He's the author of Coleridge and the Daemonic Imagination, 2011, which won the University English Book Prize, 2012. He's also a widely published poet, the author of 2 poetry collections, Maskwork, 2020, and The Fetch, 2016, as well as the pamphlets The Body in the Well, 2007, and with photographs by Phil Thomson, Balanuve, 2021. He's currently working on 3 further projects that extend his groundbreaking work on Coleridge, exploring how Coleridge's philosophical engagement with religion exceeds its nominally Christian context, and articulating his own pioneering thinking on poetry and the transnatural in relation to the reading and writing of poetry today. His talk for us today is on poetic faith and the secret life of poetry. Greg.
Thank you so much, Tom. That's a very generous and warm introduction, and I'd like to appoint you to do all my introductions from now on, in fact. So thank you very much indeed. It's great to be with you today. So Tom very kindly will be moving the slides on for me in due course. So thank you in advance for that, Tom. So as you've heard, I'm going to talk about what Coleridge called that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which constitutes poetic faith. And the first part of that phrase, the willing suspension of disbelief, is familiar and of course very widely used in Anglophone cultures around the world. The critic Thomas McFarland actually called it undoubtedly, this is Thomas McFarland, undoubtedly the single most famous critical formulation in all of English literature. But its origins, and in particular what I contend to be the radical implications of Coleridge's seminal idea and its ongoing significance, both for the composition and the reading of poetry, are not so frequently considered. So let me begin with its original context, in which, in fact, we find Coleridge in his mid-40s, contemplating in Biographia Literaria, his critical autobiography of 1817, the past, recalling and describing the heady poetic aspirations of 20 years before. And Coleridge presents his formula of poetic faith as a kind of critical philosophical apparatus to accompany and in some sense justify the poetry of the supernatural, or we might say the transnatural, we can come back to that term later on, that he wrote from 1797 to 99. The mystery poems, as they're sometimes called, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Kubla Khan, and Christabel being 3 most famous examples. And this was the period from which both Coleridge and Wordsworth would take their bearings as poets and thinkers for the rest of their lives. Coleridge's account of it in Biographia is also therefore a kind of Genesis myth framed as a critical principle. Could I have the first slide, please, Tom? It was agreed, writes Coleridge, that my endeavours should be directed to persons and characters supernatural, or at least romantic, yet so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitutes poetic faith. Now there are several words and phrases here that attract attention: the supernatural, or at least romantic, a semblance of truth, shadows of imagination, willing suspension, and of course, poetic faith itself. And I revisit all of these terms in what follows, briefly in some cases. But notice first, however, that word procure, on which the principle of poetic faith turns. The poet seeks to produce, to procure a certain state in the reader. We're suddenly presented with an account of literary seduction, in which poetry, by the power of words akin, you could say, to a kind of act of magic, produces in the reader a state of active fascination. That's what we'll call it, active fascination. Crucially, however, this does not involve the obliteration of the reader's will. It's not an act of domination as such. On the contrary, the poet's task, as Coleridge describes it, implies an appeal to the freedom of the will. This is made clearer a little later in the Biographia when Coleridge expands on the process of poetic seduction, this state of active fascination, as I'm calling it. Next slide, please, Tom. Here he is again. The reader should be carried forward by the pleasurable activity of mind excited by the attractions of the journey itself. Like the motion of a serpent, which the Egyptians made the emblem of intellectual power, or like the path of sound through the air. At every step he pauses and half recedes, and from the retrogressive movement collects the force which again carries him onward. Precipitandus est liber spiritus. The free spirit must be hurried onward, says Petronius Arbiter most happily. The epithet liber here balances the preceding verb, and it is not easy to conceive more meaning condensed in fewer words. It's a rather wonderful description of the processes involved in poetry. The motion of the serpent and the sound wave both figure an interaction of will and resistance, at once willingly proceeding and at the same time being carried forward in some way. This sort of give and take, the active and passive working in concert. And poetry, Coleridge suggests, should play upon and draw out its reader's latent imaginative freedom. It's trying to activate something in them, to bring about this state. Though the power to fascinate that the poet invests in the poem procures then a willing suspension of disbelief. Will. The old Latin word carmen, from which the English word charm derives, could signify at one and the same time a poem, a song, a ritual formula, and a spell. That's quite an appropriate kind of image for what's going on here. That all of these things are sort of being played out potentially in the idea of poetry that Coleridge is presenting. But what happens in this enchantment of the will by the action of the poem? The suspension of disbelief implies the suspension of all cognitive barriers that might inform that disbelief and hinder the affective psychotropic power conducted in those shadows of imagination. In the moment of that willing suspension, the self is exposed to influences beyond its conscious control. For Coleridge, the poetic imagination does indeed operate by a kind of stealth. Adapting a poem by Sir John Davies, died in 1626, this is also in Biographia, Coleridge writes that the truths of poetry, reclothed in diverse names and fates, steal access through our senses to our minds. They steal access through our senses to our minds. And in this state of poetic faith, which describes the reader's participatory relationship with the poem, conjured by the poem itself, the imaginal assumes the experiential force of the real. Indeed, it presents us with the reality of the imaginal. Now, the poetic principle that Coleridge describes in retrospect here is demanding. Why go to all that trouble of procuring a state of poetic faith in the reader, and indeed in using the supernatural, or at least romantic, shadows of imagination into which the semblance of truth must be invested in the spell of the poem, the Carmen, if it is to work? Why do all that? So my answer to that question involves three elements here, which Coleridge brings himself together. This peculiar alignment between the supernatural, the idea of poetry, and indeed how these in combination relate to the principle of education. The idea of education, which is at the heart of his concerns as a poet and a thinker. Education in the very broadest sense of the word, as we'll see. Now, Coleridge's interest in the supernatural and the romantic dates back to his earliest reading and remains central to his development as a poet and philosopher throughout his life. In March 1797, then a young reviewer of popular romances, Coleridge told William Lyle Bowles that Osorio, his new play he was writing, would be, quote, romantic and wild and somewhat terrible, close quotes. But he also complained that he was almost weary of the terrible, in his own words, having reviewed so many books in which, and I quote again, dungeons and old castles and solitary houses by the seaside and caverns and woods and extraordinary characters and all the tribe of horror and mystery have crowded on me, even to surfeiting. So this implies that while Coleridge is self-conscious of affinities between these works and the kind of material he was then working on, principally Osorio is what he's talking about there, Coleridge didn't readily identify the mystery poems that he would go on to write shortly after, Time of the Ancient Mariner, Kubla Khan, Christabel, didn't readily identify those poems with those romances necessarily, even though his subsequent plans for essays on the uses of the preternatural and the marvellous in poetry show that his participation in a wider tradition was quite deliberate. Rather than popular sensationalism, Coleridge's approach was characterized by its concern with what we might call the Gnostic authenticity of the imagination, the relationship between imagination and a kind of knowing, its capacity, as he later put it in The Friend, to shadow out some important truth. His contribution to Robert Southey's Joan of Arc in 1795 demonstrates the intimate connection Coleridge had already made between the imagination, what he called superstition, and the psychological springs of human spirituality. Could I have the next slide, please, Tom? Here's a little extract from his contribution there. For fancy, which is at this time quite synonymous with imagination, actually, for Coleridge. This is 1795. For fancy is the power that first unsensualizes the dark mind, giving it new delights, and bids it swell with wild activity. and peopling air by obscure fears of beings invisible, emancipates it from the grosser thrall of the present impulse, teaching self-control till superstition with unconscious hand seat reason on her throne. So here imagination and its kind of the psychic drama of its activity in relation to the living world, the natural world, is presented as the quickening agent of human becoming, a germinating power at the roots of our self-ordering and our self-consciousness. So to cultivate these powers for Coleridge is to cultivate something fundamental to our humanity and its potential. I use the word cultivate here deliberately as this word assumed great importance for Coleridge. The process of cultivation is inherently poetic. It's one of making, the ancient Greek poiesis, meaning making. And it became a central principle of both his spiritual and political philosophy. He wrote that in, quotes, cultivation, in the harmonious development of those qualities and faculties that characterize our humanity, are the grounds of both the permanency and progressiveness necessary to the well-being of society. As Coleridge well knew, culture and cultivation share an etymological root with the Latin cultus and colere, whose meanings fuse the cultivation of land, ritual observance, and the education of the person. Coleridge emphasized the latter as the grounds of all humanity. To educate is, or should be, to cultivate the springs and energies of our becoming. So the educative impulse in Coleridge's work grew out of his desire to change the world, nothing less. As the contemporary jurist and philosopher Philip Allott has put it, the only power over power is the power of ideas. And it is a strikingly consistent feature of Coleridge's thinking from his earliest political advocacy to his later philosophy, that the cultivation of the mind, the life of the ideas, the life of feeling too, is fundamental to any lasting, meaningful reform of human society. In the Conciones ad Populum of 1795, which is reprinted in the 1818 edition of the Friend, he described the principle that general illumination should precede revolution as a truth as obvious as that the vessel should be cleansed before we fill it with a pure liquor. As late as 1833, the year before he died, he wrote that, quote, "From the very outset, I hoped in no advancement of humanity, but from individual minds and morals, working onward from individual to individual." Now, this focus on the inner being was, of course, made all the more urgent for Coleridge by the failure, as he saw it, of the French Revolution to achieve the kind of social and political reform that he had wished to see. And writing to his brother George in March 1798, in the middle of writing the mystery poems, and already deeply advanced in that poetic project, he describes his aims. Next slide, please, Tom. In poetry, to elevate the imagination and set the affections in right tune by the beauty of the inanimate, impregnated as with a living soul by the presence of life. In prose, to the seeking with patience and the slow, very slow mind, quid sumus et quid nam victuri gignimur, what our faculties are and what they are capable of becoming. Now, Coleridge illustrates his meaning, variatim, with Wordsworth's then recent fragment, which affirms the power of, quote, shadowy sympathies with things that hold an inarticulate language, to stimulate our minds and multiply the spiritual presences of absent things. Stimulate our minds and multiply the spiritual presences of absent things. And that it's those shadowy sympathies with the inarticulate experience of the world that stimulate those those powers. Now, in light of this, we should bear in mind that the poetry of 1797 to 99, those mystery poems, and its philosophical apparatus was intended to be mind-altering. The Biographia Literaria, then, is, among other things, a belated embodiment and expression of that intention, an accompaniment to the mystery poems, articulating, justifying their constitutive principles. Coleridge had felt the need for this accompaniment since 1800 at the latest. Wordsworth's preface to the Lyrical Ballads was, as we know, a product of Coleridge's urging, but besides other differences in poetics that the preface revealed, it did not address Coleridge's endeavours as he would later define them in Biographia. It remained for Coleridge then to describe the nature of the connection between poetry and the supernatural that he had in mind. He started thinking about this at the time, as soon as it became clear that Christabel would not appear in the second edition of Lyrical Ballads. In March 1801, Coleridge wrote that he would, quote, immediately publish my Christabel with 2 essays annexed to it on the preternatural and on metre. And he contacted Longman about publishing Christabel, along with, again, 2 discourses, he says, concerning metre and concerning the marvellous in poetry. And this dovetailed with the idea for an essay on the elements of poetry, as he called it, that he'd mentioned to Humphrey Davy in October 1800, and which, he later enthused, would supersede all the books of metaphysics hitherto written, and all the books of morals too. I love Coleridge's ambition. For sundry reasons, he got sidetracked from that task, but it re-emerged in 1815, when he began to take stock of his achievements as a poet and critic, and to plan his own re-emergence as a distinctive, independent voice. He planned a general preface on, quote, the principles of philosophic and genial criticism relatively to the fine arts in general, to which he would add, quote, a particular preface to the Ancient Mariner and the Ballads on the employment of the supernatural in poetry and the laws which regulate it. So he's still thinking about these things. It never went away. Indeed, at the end of chapter 13 of the Biographia, famously curtailed by a fictional letter written by Coleridge himself, Coleridge defers whatever else he has to say on the powers and the privileges of the imagination, as he calls it, to, quotes, the critical essay on the uses of the supernatural in poetry and the principles that regulate its introduction, which the reader will find prefixed to the poem of the Ancient Mariner. Now, of course, that never emerged as a separate essay, but in effect, he transposes his theory of imagination into the mystery poems and their poetics. Rather like a conjurer, Coleridge promises that his essay will appear. When the cabinet is opened, however, it does not appear to be there. But Coleridge is no ordinary conjurer. The essay is there, after all, transfigured, at once condensed and scattered in the principle of poetic faith. And Coleridge presents this as this nexus, this principle of poetic faith, as the fulcrum on which the 2 volumes of Biographia Literaria turn. The end, joins the end of the first volume with the start of the second volume. So it's at once the fulcrum of his aims and achievements in the mystery poems and of the poetics that really distinguished his writing from that of his friend Wordsworth. So I now turn once again to the origins and dynamics of the principle itself. Look a bit closer. So in my book that Tom's mentioned, Coleridge and the Daemonic Imagination, I sort of refuted the widely held view that Coleridge had developed the idea of poetic faith in his discussion of stage illusion in his 1808 lecture series. Now there, in the 1808 lecture series, Coleridge does describe how, quote, stage presentations are to produce a sort of temporary half-faith, which the spectator encourages in himself and supports by a voluntary contribution on his own part. Now that clearly anticipates the famous formulation in the Biographia, but in fact it applies a principle Coleridge was already forming explicitly in prose in early 1797. In his anonymous review of Matthew Lewis's controversial Gothic novel The Monk, which was published in the Critical Review in February 1797, Coleridge writes that Lewis had failed to portray convincingly how beings like ourselves would feel and act when faced with the supernatural. So that, Coleridge writes, the effect was not preternatural, but contrary to nature. Important distinction. He goes on, to trace the nice boundaries beyond which terror and sympathy are deserted by the pleasurable emotions. To reach those limits, yet never to pass them. Hic labor, hoc opus est, this is the work and the labour. Here is the genesis of poetic faith, Coleridge's desire to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and semblance of truth to those shadows of imagination, and so to procure, that key word, the willing suspension of disbelief for the moment. Now, Coleridge criticises Lewis for failing to achieve for the preternatural this condition of fictive truth. And as a result of this failure, the mind is unseduced and remains experientially remote from the affective, psychotropic power of the imagination that Coleridge's radical poetics sought to direct. Now, Coleridge reiterates this principle in the following little-known formulation, which actually dates to May 1830, long after Coleridge is supposed by some to have lost interest in such matters. Next slide, please, Tom. Thank you. In poetry, whether metrical or unbound, the supernatural will be impressive and obtain a mastery over the imagination and feelings, will tend to infect the reader and draw him to identify himself with or substitute himself for the person of the drama or tale in proportion as it is true to nature, i.e., where the poet of his free will and judgment does what the believing narrator of a supernatural incident, apparition, or charm does from ignorance and weakness of mind. How suggestive that phrase is, to infect the reader. And how explicit is that idea of doing something deliberately entering this sort of realm of superstition, this realm of the preternatural, transnatural, as a poet, and using that in order to access something that might not otherwise be accessed without succumbing to any kind of literalism. Now, the mystery poems are the mythopoesis, I think, of Coleridge's own infection and of his will, indeed, to infect his readers with his own appetite for the transnatural, these quickening agents of human becoming in the stimulus of the mind and the feeling. Now, taking up the challenge he had begun to define in that 1797 review, Coleridge, as I said earlier, aspired to produce this state of active fascination in his readers through an act of poetic seduction that would arouse what he called in a later notebook entry, which I very much like, the strange self-power in the imagination. That, he goes on, even to the anguish or the triumph of the quasi-credent soul, gives to the eve-lengthened shadow that haunts the self a place and substance and living energy. Let's say this paradoxical state of active fascination in which the reader is at once entranced and made inwardly active, is really fundamental to Coleridge's Poetics and, indeed, the secret life of poetry more generally, I believe. Pondering elsewhere this paradox of a state at once active and passive in relation to the clairvoyance of the zoomagnetists, in his phrase, Coleridge conceived of a state for which no word exists. A state not of sleep, he says, but anthipnos, the opposite to sleep, or counter-sleep. That's his phrase. Poetry, then, in its Coleridgean ideal, might be described as a form of antihypnosis, counter-hypnosis, in which the reader is hypnotized, awake. What might we call this counter-hypnotic power of poetry as a medium of perceptual, epistemic, and affective wakefulness? Well, last year I suggested, when I was writing another essay, the word egregnosis, egregnosis, which is likewise from the ancient Greek egregoros, which means wakeful. And yes, I know what you're thinking. That is where my first name is derived from too. Egregnosis. That's my new word for the day. So the process of poetic fascination that holds you and alters you in its moment operates in ways both intellectual and more than intellectual. We are opened inside the ecstatic space-time of the poem to what we might not otherwise be open to. And this is one secret of the poem's power of origination and renewal. We're getting closer to the secret life of poetry, which is at the heart of my talk today. Why a poet should aim to procure this state of poetic faith. Why infect the reader in and through the poetry of the supernatural or transnatural. That is, a poetry focused on the imaginal, forms, beings, and states that do not exist in nature. It's telling that from 1800 at the latest, as we've heard, Coleridge always connected his plans for an essay on the supernatural in poetry with an essay on meter. And these twin concerns address the operative effects of poetry he has in mind and the interaction of form and subject. And their connection goes some way towards explaining Coleridge's insistence that Christabel involved a new principle of meter. Now, to do full justice to this aspect of things would probably require not just one, but several. But I'll confine myself here to some brief remarks. Poetry for Coleridge is, as I said, the art of making words carry more, do more than their dictionary meaning, through its manipulation of the somatic, psychoactive, auricular qualities inherent in language. Poetry brings language into dynamic relationship with the life beyond language, conjuring and quickening the pre-verbal rhythms and energies of our being in verbal forms with supraverbal effects. A poem produces an eruptive pattern, modulating breath, activating the silence as it breaks it, and in this, like music, manipulates time and creates its moment, that is, at once its duration and its turning force, the ecstatic space-time of the poem to which I've already referred. The orality and auricular form of poetry, sourced in the body, is one of its distinguishing virtues and cultivates a relationship between sound and sense, the psychic and the somatic, the numinous and the sensuous. In vital ways, its seeing is the work of sound, vibrations that propagate acoustic waves. Poetry rides the intimate connection between rhythm, vibration, and psychophysiological effect. Coleridge's writings on music or musical effects here are very interesting. So he saw, quotes, the sense of musical delight with the power of producing it as a gift of imagination, an essential characteristic of what he called original poetic genius. Music he described as an art magic, and he said it converses with the life of my mind, as if it were itself the mind of my life. Interesting thing to say. And poetry directs and amplifies these affective qualities in constituting what Coleridge called the vital and idea-creating force of language. Poetry involves the power of invocation, and in his insistence on its existentially productive power, Coleridge invests this post-Enlightenment idea of poetry with the form and force of magic. The life of poetry, then, for Coleridge does bear a direct relation to the supernatural as he conceives it. In chapter 3 of the Biographia, an essay on poetics occasioned by a critique of Maturin's Bertram, Coleridge makes the link between poetry, the supernatural, and poetic faith quite explicit in describing their relationship to the arousal of what he calls intellectual power. Next slide, please, Tom. He writes, "Of all intellectual power, that of superiority to the fear of the invisible world is the most dazzling. Its influence is abundantly proved by the one circumstance that it can bribe us into a voluntary submission of our better knowledge in the suspension of all our judgment derived from constant experience, and enable us to peruse with the liveliest interest the wildest tales of ghosts, wizards, genii, and secret talismans. On this propensity, so deeply rooted in our nature, a specific dramatic probability may be raised by a true poet if the whole of his work be in harmony. A dramatic probability sufficient for dramatic pleasure, even when the component characters and incidents border on impossibility. The poet does not require us to be awake and believe. He solicits us only to yield ourselves to a dream, and this too with our eyes open and with our judgment perdu, hidden behind the curtain, ready to awaken us at the first motion of our will, and meantime only not to disbelieve." There again, you can hear the formulation of poetic faith and that willing suspension of disbelief procured by the true poet, as he says. The power of the invisible world is brought to life in and through the performance of the creative imagination, and hence is realized, in a sense, in actual experience, without having to determine whether or not that world is real. And in this way, the dynamics of poetic faith effect a corresponding arousal of the spiritual and intellectual life of the reader, and indeed assume the force of metaphysical inception. In a lecture plan of February 1819, Coleridge proposed to discuss, quotes, "the uses of poetry in the process of the mind's education, especially on the supernatural." The Coleridge never gave that lecture, we don't think, but something of its import, I hope, might have been conveyed in what I've been describing today. Just as the mystery poems and the accompanying principle of poetic faith implicate the numinous, so education, that idea of education for Coleridge, implied the cultivation and empowering of what we call the noumenal in relation to the phenomenal, the inward in relation to the outward. Coleridge often repeated that education consists in educing, that is, leading forth the faculties and forming the habits. And being able to read and write is not enough for Coleridge. He drew a distinction between education and instruction. And in a complaint that still maybe resonates today, he wrote that he saw young people everywhere quote, most anxiously and expensively beschoolmastered, betutored, belectured, anything but educated. By education, Coleridge meant what he said Plato, who he called the poetic philosopher, had meant. That is, quote, awakening the principle and method of self-development, and not in any specific information that can be conveyed into it from without. In this sense, he wrote, education is the nisus formativus of social man, the formative urge, impulse, or force, the vis plastica or vis vitae formatrix, the life or the living principle of our development as human beings. It is active and creative. To educate, he says, is, quote, to educe, to call forth, as the blossom is educed from the bud, the vital excellencies are within. In Coleridge's terms, education calls forth ideas which for him equated to spiritual truths. An idea being, quotes, an educt of the imagination actuated by the pure reason, to which there neither is nor can be an adequate correspondent in the world of the senses. Nonetheless, these ideas, these inward kind of powers, really, these enabling powers, are, he says, and I quote again, constitutive and one with the power and life of nature. So these powers operate as a kind of organizing principle or shaping spirit of the mind. It's a kind of dance. The awakening and quickening of these powers constitutes what Coleridge meant by education, and he directly links this to poetry and indeed to the poetry of the supernatural. As he wrote in a late notebook, there are, quotes, magic sounds and magic combinations of sounds that can do this, invoking presences that can never be wholly comprised by human understanding, but operate upon experience with what he called an endless power of semination, an endless power of semination seeding within ourselves. Now, poetry in and through the creative principle of poetic faith effects such invocation, if it's working well. If, as Coleridge wrote, education is the protoplast, the shaper of true humanity, then poets who combine, as he wrote elsewhere, fancy, imagination, superstition, etc., with reason and order, poets fuse all of these things. He says they are the true protoplasts, the makers. Then, in that case, poetry can act, as he says elsewhere, act as an awakening ferment, a generative principle on a mind. So Coleridge in Poetics uses the powers of poetic fascination to liberate the mind, actually, to arouse and to know its own power as active, constitutive, and creative. And I'll wrap up here. In this sense, poetic faith is a kind of conducting rod between Coleridgean poetry and Coleridgean metaphysics. Its awakenings thrive on the poetics of mystery. Poetry, supernatural, and this quite rich and rare ideal of education blend actually and find their affinity in poetic faith. One of my favorite moments that he uses the term poetic faith is when he says, poetic faith before which our common notions of philosophy give way. These are at least some of the ways in which the principle of poetic faith carries within itself a super condensed essay in the secret life of poetry. And I'll finish there. I know Tom's got the next slide. Just add some reading, some links and bits and bobs to things I've written that kind of are relevant to the themes I've been talking about there. Now, I will. I'll take a breath, and then I'll.
Yeah, you want to go straight into the poetry reading, or would you like to?
I'm happy to do whatever you think's best, Tom. So I can read some poems, and then we can have a more general chat, or whatever you prefer.
Yeah, well, I think shall we carry on with the poetry reading after
Yeah.
you've had a breath?
Yeah. I'll just have another swig of tea.
So we can see it in action as well as having.
Well, you know, I've just realised I've really set myself up here, haven't I? Because after going on with all these very grand terms, but remember how difficult I said it was to achieve the state of poetic failure. It's a very demanding principle. But so I thought I'd read. I'd focus actually on this connection between poetry and the transnatural, actually, in the poems that I'm going to read to you now, in the next 15 minutes or so. And I think I'll start with the title poem of my book, The Fetch. Now, Fetch, as many of you might know, is it's a double or apparition or a wraith of a living person. So I'll just start with that. The Fetch. It's also an irregular sonnet for those of you who are interested in such things. And it is based on a dream I had. Actually, I should say that as well, in case that's of interest. The Fetch. The dream that slammed the bedroom door, but didn't break the film of sleep to tell the time, or give me more than broken promises to keep to phantoms that were never there, woke me just enough to know that something was. The restless air, the waveform of a note too low to hear, a song to raise the dead. I listened and began to speak as I am speaking now. My breath condensed. I saw it slowly take the outline of a child, afraid of the dark of which it was made. I'll read next another poem from The Fetch, and this is called The Pact, P-A-C-T. I was always, at my local library where I grew up, had this astonishing collection of sort of books on the occult and magic and witchcraft and all sorts of things. And I remember that there was one book called Witchcraft, Magic and Alchemy, and that I came across as a teenager, and it had these wonderful woodcuts in from the 17th century, 16th, 17th century, and they kind of haunted me, really. Clearly stayed in my imagination, of these meetings between warlocks and sort of demonic figures, and making agreements, pacts with them sometimes. I'm sure this poem traces its origins there. The pact. A secret place was all the note said of where to meet. I chose the woods I walked, the time I lost the key to my house, returning to find a stranger asleep on my bed, who woke to say sorry, he got tired while waiting. Since then, I've been writing, letting the phone ring, dropping my friends. The work grew like a child between my daylight hours, a 9-month seal of shared blood, melted in the wax of a waning flame that tapered to a scrawl I knew as mine, telling me, go tonight. The figure in liquid silhouette, stepped from the sky between a symmetry of silver birch, quiet as the morning star. Held in split and dawn-red eyes, I felt a kiss of a voice on my throat, sing through my skin with the touch of the air. I don't know how long I was weightless in the promise of those words. They thinned to silence as the sky paled. I, stretched in the darkened sun, mindful of what would be waiting in my empty house, whether it would return this greater loss. I'll move now to Maskwork, my most recent collection with 9 Arches Press, came out in autumn 2020, and a poem now called Musician, which is really about the power of story in some sense, but of course a poem is never just about. A poem is its own event. It's a little story. Like a lot of my poems, I'm very interested in the fusion of lyric and myth. So lyric myths tend to be a recurring form with me. Musician. That night plays back scratched vinyl, but here's my fiddle. The lane led way out, and I went, though dark had spilt and shook the stars in black water where I walked, dressed for day and led by story, nothing more. The spirits I'd swilled warmed my blood, but the cold drank. I knew I didn't have long before the blue moon stilled my flesh to crystal. I heard it come, the air at work, the medium lipping my ears and mouth, spittled fingers circling my skin to make it ring. I felt the bow I'd hung at my back grow taut, and the raw strings of what you call my violin thrill for the kiss. They braced to meet and make a voice. And then I was there. The blind road emptied into a field, as if where I stepped a sudden breath had blown the earth to a sphere of glass. I met that world's musician, a white moth, a light within its whisper. One of us said, play, and I did, and what it spoke, I learned, even as it danced me to the bone, in sound that shivered to a mute dawn. I woke under dew in open ground. I had no home. You don't have to believe me, but I can tell your body heard. The song gets through. That's how I got this tune on my tongue. The next poem is another kind of encounter poem. Again, has its origin in something that really happened to me walking in the deep wood, the forest of Dean in England, and I had an encounter with a deer, a very close encounter. This deer sort of turned out to be right next to the path, and I hadn't noticed, and it sprang up. But yeah, this poem is called Doe. Inside the green rhythm, below rippling leaves, turned from the squint of a sickly heat, the doe and I were breath, held in exchange for a sense not yet our own, but heard in a call from the nerve of this wood, spoken as a bird that lit the feathered shade. We stepped into its space, we fell and flew towards. Each time we stopped to tilt an ear, to listen for the trail of the other's voice. I tried to speak the name for friend, and the sound came back as the bark of trees, point blank at my skin, that let me slip like a finger through their silent folds, teaching my touch to hatch like an egg. Don't be afraid, I almost said, if not to myself, to the verging dead, bone dust scattered in bluebells, death bells knelling death's end in the sough of the wild that led her and me, sly as lovers, into the secret taut as a web. We opened like flowers, our scent thickening air moist with the dew of our lungs, limbed with antennae fed on the dark light of the radiant body, afoot or sweet with rot where it fell. We flickered like a tongue from an adder's jaw and flared at our meeting, revealed. The doe startled from her mottled bed, as if, this time, I had spoken her true name and fled. I'll read a poem that does make direct reference to a magical object here. It's called a puppet, and as you might know, puppets are kind of dolls used in witchcraft. It can also be a term of affection, of course. But there's a few of these on display if you'd like to see them sometime at the Museum of Witchcraft down in Boscastle in Cornwall in England. Yes, I won't say any more. This is a puppet. When I dug you up like a potato, you could have been vegetable, grown in earth too long, lost by a girl who gave you her name and worried her parents to death with her love for your unstitched eyes, whose loose threads look into mine as I bath you until the water is black and your human hair is chestnut again, and the hemp sack of your skin is warm from the fire I nearly put you in. The embers are cold when I think I wake, to find you folded into my bed, and your voice thrown to the tilth of my garden, growing you bone by bone, with words no human breath could hold, biting my tongue and drawing blood that tastes wrong as I follow, now a father to a lost child, and feel small hands push me into fresh torn ground. When I think I wake, your small hands lift me out. And I think I'll finish now with a poem called Consistori del Gai Saber. And this is one of the final poems in Maskwork. You might know that there was a real Consistori del Gai Saber, the Consistory of Joyous Knowledge. And it was founded in Toulouse in 1323 to cultivate the art of lyric poetry. My version is an imaginary version, an imaginary Consistori del Gai Saber, kind of dislocated from time and place a little bit, but that's all I'll say by way of that. I think apart from just to say it does contain just a few words in Occitan, the language of Provençal, dictador, poet, the Violetta d'Or, the golden violet. Now this was the prize given to the poet in their competitions, the winning poet each year. Joglar, juggler, which also has connotations of performer and magician. Yes, I think that's all I need to say. So I'll end with this. So thank you very much for listening. I think my voice will carry me to the end of this, and then I'll have another swig of tea. So, Consistori del Gai Sever. Tell those who come they have to find the sound of knowing for themselves, as I did 377 moons ago. It is nothing so fixed as the earth at the centre of the spheres, which, mark me, is a truth that will loosen like a slip of the tongue. But the maker of fact, the spell that makes you a fiction, howbeit real. But I'm going too fast. It begins with overhearing the dead in the living. What else is a word but a ghost sent feeling its way? The centuries passed on your breath, and in this the feet of surprise. When a stranger speaks and it sounds upon you a promise of being that it keeps as it touches the stem of your fate, something like a voice that you love. That is the invisible body of our wandering college, to which anyone can belong, if they choose. For me, born without money or precedent, but yes, loved, and my weird strong enough, one dead dictador became my teacher. The music in words can be its own song. I imagine him lit by brandy and candle, the room drunk for a moment on language, and he half aware that those who listen have not yet been born. Look for the signs that tell you the student has heard the dead and plays for them as they would for a friend. Look for signs that the dead have heard. This is not solemn. The Violetta d'Or has to be earned, as does the ear of those who come after. They, like the language, deserve our best benefaction. Listen. The golden oriole is back and arcs the air with his whistle. He is a jongleur like me, the magus of this morning's tarok. Look how the hard at work and self-absorbed alike ignore the pageant of his arrival. But let's not be doleful. There's a joke in the tragic mask of their loss, as old as laughter itself. Just as a prude is the dupe of sex, and the sober are fools of reason. Unwilling clowns are clowns nonetheless. Better to choose to play. Our students should have a stomach for paradox, and impatience only with the absence of love. We have the freedom of fallen beings. Think not of fresco devils, nor huddled angels with blue-washed wings, but their nameless painter at work in the temple of their imagining, the art in the thought of transfiguring, who wears the horned brow of an ecstasy older than Christendom. Forgive my heresy, but we who perform have a habit of asking to be forgiven in the very trespass of our voice. We belong to no class but our calling. Our ways are promiscuous as language, over which we raise the sign of eros. When I speak, it's to kiss my absent lover, who may not even be human. I like a music that reaches where speech is forbidden unless it speaks in wonder. That is the beginning and the end of our learning. If you can hear my smile, it's because I savor the romance of knowledge, even the wound of its sounding. Listen, those spheres are moving. I have told you some secrets, maybe said too much, but I never forget my audience, nor those who might be over here. Come, step through this curtain and into the sun. The world is young. I find what I learn from the oriole pleasing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg. And I'll speak for a moment just to give you time to rest and recover. So thanks, Greg, so much for that amazing poetry reading and for the talk you gave us, introducing that and in many ways helping us to read your poetry through the lens of Coleridge. You gave us a detailed exposition of what you called a super condensed essay in Coleridge's famous phrase on poetic faith, and you helped us read anew that phrase. You showed us how Coleridge's language in that well-known part of the Biographia, which you called a nexus or a sort of a hinge in that volume, how it also brings out concerns across Coleridge's career, emphasizing above all how poetry is in a full and complex sense mind-altering, I think is what you were trying to tell us, both as a sort of drug and that alters consciousness, and as itself a work of education that unhypnotizes or unsensualizes the dark mind, inducting us in the language of your closing poem there into the, at least potentially, into the college of wondering. Why do this, Greg asked, about Coleridge? And your answer suggested to me the philosopher R.G. Collingwood talking about T.S. Eliot and The Wasteland, his famous closing pronouncement there that art is the community's medicine for the worst disease of the mind, the corruption of consciousness. The problem of poetry, in a way, perhaps you were suggesting to us, is how to find the sound of knowing for ourselves. So thank you very much again for that excellent talk, Greg. And I'm sure we have lots of questions. If I may, I'll take chair's privilege and ask the first one, which is about the darker side of all this, so the unsensualizing of the dark mind. But clearly, as you showed us, the examples of Monk Lewis and Bertram show how this process can go wrong, and in a way that made me think of Wordsworth talking about how words are far too powerful an instrument to be trifled with. You know, the kind of the danger that that poetry that doesn't work in the way Coleridge wants it to work has you know, almost the complete opposite effect. Reminds me too of Coleridge famously, you know, attacking mechanical modes of education and, you know, throwing down his book and saying this reminds me more of a, you know, of a slave ship. So the question, if one comes out of that, is does Coleridge have any guardrails in place for this rich and sort of free sense of what poetry can do for the mind and how it works to educate? And I mean, and how aware, alive is he to the dangers that seem to be sort of lurking in his thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I think the guardrails, in a sense, are his attempt to articulate these things that are quite difficult to articulate in many ways. You know, to try and you know, as he said in that very early review in the February 1797, to go to find the boundaries of where it sort of tips over into the kind of failure or even the abuse of language. You know. And you know, what is the boundary between that and its success where it flies? He says something very suggestive in that review as well about the literature of the preternatural and the horrible. He says tends to be around at the rise and decline of literature. And I think that's such an interesting thing to say, because it suggests that it is this double-edged thing that can almost signal a kind of abjection, really, a sort of collapse into maybe cliche or just a kind of a mere sensationalism. But at the other, you know, the other side of that is that it can be this profound stimulus as well. And I think Coleridge absolutely lived this sort of this knife edge experience, because as we know, you know, he talked about opium actually in this way. There's a note from 1808 where he talks about, you know, speculative, what if, you know, who could he be talking about? What if, you know, there was a pernicious drug, in his phrase, that could release something in him hidden before and unlock something in his greatest contemporaries. You know, and this whole sort of doubleness, I think, really runs through the poems. You know, particularly the mystery poems, because I think they have this. Well, this, as you know, this is what the demonic imagination book's all about, really. That the simultaneity of exaltation and transgression, you know, happening at one and the same moment. And it always puts me in mind this issue of, and perhaps this applies to language more generally, and that idea of the power of language, its susceptibility to abuse. That sort of wonderful phrase from Heraclitus: "The way up and the way down are one and the same." You know, and I think language does, the valency of language, the very thing that gives it its power for all of this wonderful stimulating stuff, is also the thing that can be abused. So I think to circle back, the guardrail, the protective element, is this attempt to try and articulate those principles by which we can read better. It's about a quality of reading in many ways, and I mean reading in the very broadest sense of that word. You know, its older sense of just comprehending or understanding. And I think this is why Coleridge worried away so much about the principle of education, because, you know, if you don't have that nourished, then the likelihood of language, and indeed everything else, being abused or kind of slipping into a sort of abject state becomes all the more you know, all the more present. So I think it circles right back to the whole idea of education, actually, and the importance he attached on it. I think this is one of the things that can lead people to accuse him of being an elitist, because let's face it, he's terribly demanding. You know, and the demands he places on people are incredibly high. You know, but I think it's rooted in this genuine concern. You know, a genuine concern for education in its broadest sense of the word. Yeah.
Thanks, Greg. I had the word elitism in mind when I was you know, thinking how I would come back on this, because obviously, I mean, it reminds me too of the thing in The Excursion, where I think it is the debate between the wanderer, who's Wordsworth, and the solitary, who sort of is Coleridge, where I'm going to butcher the phrasing, but it's something about, you know, that the wanderer's vision of education by nature bids the butterfly fly that has no wings, or something, that it sort of puts the cart before the horse. It presupposes that you have this unique mode of education by which you can then become fully free through that sort of rich process.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Coleridge is not. I mean, he is an elitist in many ways, but he's also, you know, I think he, in things like texts like Church and State that you referenced, he's finding ways of getting at what sort of sources of common knowledge that can then be refined by a real process of thinking, and not the kind of instruction, as you were.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, what you were just saying about the wanderer solitary tension, it's there in, you know, well, quite explicitly, isn't it, in those slightly sort of mischievous letters he sends to Alsop, and you know, where he's saying, you know, well, this inferred dependency of the human soul on where it was born and all the rest of it, as if, and he says, well, Wordsworth makes the common mistake of thinking everybody's like Wordsworth. You know, all these shepherds, you know, the sad truth is not all of the shepherds of Cumberland are like Wordsworth. You know, so actually Coleridge is very down to earth, kind of, you know, refreshingly down to earth about this. You know, he says, you know, it's not come from just being born in that place. It's come from the cultivation of the ideas and all of those impossible to know variables that sort of feed into the development of a personality, the growth of a poet's mind, you know, which of course was at the centre of Wordsworth's concerns and Coleridge's. So yeah, that, you know, where does the educative material and impulse come from? I mean, that's again a perpetual tension that runs right through their work, not between them. It's sort of there in Wordsworth, of course, in many ways too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Do we have other questions for Greg? Oh, I can see Elena. Elena has.
Yes, hello, professors. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I have a question here, Will, about poetical faith. Yes, speaking of poetical faith, well, I basically agree with that. And the builders of purely personal utopias and the poets who have faith in the midst of existential hardship are not actually expressing themselves, but elevating themselves and the readers to a very high level of poetry. So basically, they don't want poetry to trank themselves or trank their life, but life in turn mimics the poetry. So I'm confused with that, and I want to know your opinions about this argument. Thank you.
So the tension between life and art, in a way, if I've understood your question correctly.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, again, it's a really interesting one. I think that there's a very nice thing that there's an Irish poet who lives in London called Maurice Riordan said when he was the editor of the Poetry Review, which is sort of the largest sort of poetry magazine in the UK. And he said the relationship between art and life, or the poem and the poet, he says, he described it as an umbilical relationship. You know, so it's both nourished by but separate from. And he makes the interesting point that at some point, if the poem is going to live as a poem and not just a kind of biographical account, then it needs to enter what he called the autonomous realm of fiction. The autonomous realm of fiction. And I think that's a really nice way of phrasing it. And for me, I think, again, the form of words the fact that poems focus so intensely on language, there's an impersonal quality that ends up coming out through that very concentration, I think. And so this is what, paradoxically, enables the poet to learn something from their own poetry. Because they're not entirely in command of it. It's not something that's just a matter of deliberate control and planning. As the Irish American poet Michael Donaghy said, if you already knew exactly what you were going to say in a poem, it's not poetry, it's advertising. And that's quite a nice way of putting it as well. So I think it's this kind of, it's the intensity of focus on language, on making something in language, in and through language, that enables a kind of impersonality to arise in the process, which in turn is, as I say, what allows the poet themselves to be nourished by their own poetry, to learn something from it. Does that answer your question? Or at least...
Thank you, that is fantastic.
Okay, thank you.
Laura.
Hello, hi, and thank you very much for your beautiful talk and for the generous gift of your poems. Now, I come from film studies, so my question is a bit off field. So if it's irrelevant, just feel free to ignore it. So when you were giving the talk about Coleridge and poetic faith, I was kind of reminded of something that I read recently in the latest book of poems that I read, which is not Coleridge at all. It's a book of poems by a feminist poet called Robin Morgan, and the book is called Dark Matter. And in that book, she, in some ways, she reckons with what I think might have been what potentially killed her, which was I think, judging just solely from the poems, which is a degenerative brain disease. So she writes quite a lot about the splendid powers of the brain, as she calls them. And in one poem, she talks about and again, I didn't fact check this, so I assume she did, because she's working with scientific findings. And in one poem, she reflects on this finding that she thinks a poet might sort of take a lot of benefit from, which is that the brain, she says in that poem, something along the lines of the brain doesn't differentiate between experience and imagination. And when the fingertips touch, you know, velvet canvas silk, she says, it's the same, the brain, the cortex reacts in the same way as when you read the words velvet canvas silk. So when you were talking about Coleridge and his, you know, I think at one point you talked about the experiential force of the real and how, you know, imagination aspires towards sort of achieving that. I was reminded of this poem about, you know, how the brain doesn't differentiate between imagination and experience. Well, based on her, again, I didn't fact check this. I'm going to trust the poet on this. So I guess moving towards a question, if I can tease a question out of this long thing, I was thinking, I'm sure there's, I mean, I've attended enough literature research seminars to know there's a lot written on Coleridge. So my question is there also like a cognitive poetics kind of an angle to it? Because it seems like some of these, I mean, and I know it's kind of, it probably brings down the let's say the level and the tone of the discussion, right? Because your talk was mainly lyrical and poetic and all of that, and philosophical, and I'm asking about something that has to do with cognitive and the brain. But I'm wondering about that, because it's a lot about the effects of the imagination and how imagination alters us and all of that. So I wonder about whether there's been a cognitive reading of his ideas about poetry, or whether you think there's scope for that. And one last thing, which is not a question, but I was reminded of it when you were talking, when you were reading actually one of your poems. And in that poem, you talk about encountering a doe. So because I'm also a film studies person, I was wondering whether you saw this Hungarian film called On Body and Soul. It's not a great film, but it's an interesting film. And it's about two people who work in an abattoir and slaughterhouse. And at night, they both have the same dream, which is that he is a deer and she's a doe, and they meet each other in a forest. So they kind of dream the same thing. And it's quite poetic, the film. So I thought, you know, when you read about the encounter with the doe, I kind of thought about this film. But it's not a question. It's just like throwing it in.
No, that's wonderful.
Sorry for talking so much, but I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you, Laura. I loved all of that, and I must make a note of that film because I've not seen it, so I will look at it, but I've not come across it. But yeah, the cognitive poetics. So I'm very interested in that myself, actually, as well. And so all the kind of everything you said was very, very interesting to me. And I think, funnily enough, I've touched on this. I don't think Coleridge has come into the work on cognitive poetics as much as he might have done. I've certainly done a little bit in that direction on a couple of those essays that I put up on the final slide there. But yeah, in terms of cognitive poetics, Coleridge, well, I tell you, there's one person who has done quite a lot on this, and it's an Israeli scholar called Reuven Sur. Have you come across Reuven Sur? T-S-U-R. And he's very interested in, he's quite old now, but he's done several books on this. He's very interested in kind of those hypnotic effects of rhythm in particular. And so he's definitely worth looking at on that. But there's also a book by Ewan Jones called Coleridge and the Philosophy of Poetic Form, and that's got material in there that certainly touches on this, you know, about what is it about the form of poetry itself that enables us to, well, that alters our way of thinking, you know. And so there's those areas, there's those two books, but really those are the principal kind of elements that I've come across. There's some stuff with Simon Jarvis did on Wordsworth, really. But yeah, so yeah, I'm sort of drifting in this direction myself quite a lot, because of course it's of interest to me both as a poet and as a scholar. You reminded me of some wonderful research that's been going on at Cambridge University. We're looking at the child brain, and the way, when adults tend to instinctively speak in an exaggerated way to children, sort of, how are we today? Oh, look at you, oh, like all of that. And they call it, yes, Wordsworth's philosophic song, thank you, Tom. But anyway, they call this parentese. And essentially, there is an analogy there, I think, because the baby's brains absolutely light up. If I was just talking to a baby like this and blah, 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 just in a moment, no, the baby's bored. But if I'm going, hello, 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 like this, then they absolutely light up. And I think there is this really interesting analogy there with the way those effects of poetry, because there is so much modulation and action, somatic action, bodily action in poetry. I think there's a direct relationship there. So, it chimes very much with what you were talking about. So I hope that's helpful, some kind of answer. Yeah, thanks, Tom. Tom's just put up some material on Wordsworth there. Yeah, that's right. So you'd have thought there would have been more on Coleridge and cognitive poetics, but really, it's the main focus I've come across is Rubens and to a degree in Ewan Jones's book, and some of the references he looks at in there. Yeah. Angela Layton is a very good writer on poetry and knowing, which comes into, again, literariness. And she's a very fine poet herself as well. She's based at Trinity College, Cambridge. Angela Layton did a wonderful book called On Form in 2007, which is really excellent. And she did a book called Hearing Things, on the effects of sound effects in literature, in 2018. So well worth looking at her stuff, both as a poet and as a scholar. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I think Greg was probably the best place to give the reading list on Coleridge and cognitive poetics.
Yeah, but yeah, there's not as much as you might think, actually. Yeah, on that.
Yeah,
but.
that was, yeah. In a way, you'd think there'd be a lot more, since the whole of Biographica Literaria up to that point.
I know.
People need to go back and sort of backfill.
Yeah.
Along with Hartley's theory, so he can explain his own theory of poetry and sort of also say what's wrong with Wordsworth.
Maybe that's it. Maybe Coleridge sort of, maybe the sort of feeling is Coleridge already did his own self-theorizing in a way. But I don't know. But yeah, well, he certainly loved to do that.
We have. We're actually already at time. If we have any last questions for Greg?
I got a quick question. Is that okay?
Sure, David, go ahead.
You can hear me, yeah?
Yeah. Hi, David. Yeah.
Hi, guys. Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk and really enjoyed the poetry. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
the idea of education, according to Coleridge, seems to have some kind of a spiritual dimension. Would I be right in that? And how much of a spiritual dimension would it have? And if Coleridge was around today, what would he make of the current education systems, or would he have a different idea of that word, education? And I guess I have another quick question as well concerning the writing process.
Yeah.
So you use the word infected to describe some people who you can get infected by reading a poem, but I guess you can also get infected by writing the poem. And where do you get infected? Or I know, like, you were out walking in the woods and you ran into the deer, but do you have a particular place or a particular time even that you find is the best for shall we say, breaking into that other world, like that other world of inspiration, I think.
Yeah,
Many questions, maybe. Sorry.
It's three quite big questions, actually.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, well, to go back to the first one, so I think education and spirituality are intimately linked for Coleridge, because he saw the cultivation of it's that problematic word spirituality, isn't it? We come up against the limitations of our own vocabulary in English, because I think so much burden is put on that word spirituality, but it's kind of the only word we've got, in a way, that carries that charge. But I think just that focus on the inner life, on our powers of apprehension in the broadest sense of the word, you know, how we grasp things, how we grasp and order and relate to the entirety of our habitat as well as ourselves. I think that's absolutely at the heart of Coleridge's thinking about education. It's always connected to a metaphysical apprehension of, you know, ourselves and the habitat in which we move. So that's a very brief answer. I suppose it is kind of implicit in a lot of what I was talking about there today. The interest in the supernatural, which again he directly associates with the reality of the reality of our inner lives, if you like. For him, it is real. He describes it as this now and yet other world, the other world that now is. You know, it's not another world that you go to, he says, that he's interested in. It's the other world that's already latent within us. Now, that's a wonderful sort of thing. Your second. Now, what was your second one?
The second one was about your writing process, I guess, where and the time, I guess, as well. Do you have, like, for example, some people like to write in the morning because they claim that it could be closer to the world of dreams, or you're just after coming out of sleep, so you're more susceptible to influences from the subconscious.
Yeah, I've just remembered that was your third one. Your second one was, what would he think of the education system today?
Oh yeah, because
yeah.
That question, because I think, you know, sometimes the idea of spirituality these days is kind of, in certain circles, it's like scorned upon or laughed upon, or like with some kind of intellectual scorn sometimes. So I'm wondering, what would you think of, like? But I guess it's a big question. You know, I guess it's too big.
Well, I mean, I can just briefly say, I'm sure he would say that we need to cultivate the powers of imagination and our powers to think in these terms of which I've been talking about, because I think for him, even in his day, he thought they were atrophying. You know, they were withering because they were not being given the attention that they should. And I suspect, even though, you know, we've got creative writing programs and all the rest of it today, and maybe that is possibly redressing some of that, but at the same time, creative writing programs have a tendency to become institutionalized in their own way.
Yes.
I say that as someone who runs one, as well as doing all my other stuff. So I know the tensions there, but I'm sure he would say the focus on these things that are often scorned, aesthetics, imagination, things that are treated as, oh, that's the pretend world. You want to go and play like a child. You know, he would say, well, that's completely wrong. So that's a brief answer. But then the third thing, which is just about me and my practice, really. You know what I've found over the years, because of the pressures on my time, I've become quite adaptable to writing in all sorts of but if left to my own devices, and I was lucky enough to have a month in a writing retreat in 2013 where I learned this about myself. If left to my own devices, I sort of have breakfast, sort of nose about, follow my kind of thinking, maybe look in a book until about 9:30, then write 9:30 till 1. That's a kind of core time for me. I do like that time, that morning time. And then I might write again after lunch. Then I in an ideal world, I'd always go for a big long walk late afternoon. then I'd eat, and then I'd do a bit more writing and maybe some carousing in the evening. That I found was my kind of ideal writing day. And I try to get back to it whenever I can, which isn't very often. So I find that even just snatching a half hour here or an hour there sometimes is effective for me now, but I've had to kind of practice that. And the way I get into the state, the necessary trance, as Robert Gray called it, is, well, several ways, but one way that does work is just quickly write out again where I was before. So, for example, maybe writing out the poem that I'm working on again, just so I'm back in the zone. And I work longhand when I'm writing poetry. So that physical act is quite important to me, and I think there's something about the timing of that too.
Right.
You know, it takes longer than typing. I think that helps. Yeah. So again, that's a short answer, but I hope that's useful.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. Very useful.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're already over time, so aggressively we're going to have to play. Now, thanks very much again, Greg. It was a fantastic talk, and I think we had a really great question and answer session. You educated us both through your poetry and through your talk and through your answers to those questions.
It's been a great pleasure, it really has. So thanks for having me, and you know, maybe see people around again. Tom will be in touch for sure, but yeah, it's been fun. So thank you.
Hopefully, see you in the concert sometime, Greg.
Absolutely right. Okay.
Thanks very much, guys. Enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.